A gracious good afternoon to one and all. Once again, it is your Emperor, Norton the First, Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico, coming to you once again with a little tidbit from San Francisco history. Today we will be discussing the dogs Bummer and Lazarus, perhaps the two most famous dogs to have ever lived in San Francisco. Now you must remember that in the 1850s, the waterline for San Francisco Bay's Yerba Buena Cove came to Montgomery Street. And then in the 1850s, 1860s, up until the 1920s and 30s, they started filling in the bay to create more space, flat ground essentially, in San Francisco. So in the 1860s, Montgomery Street really started to rise in status and was the home of saloons and stores, that sort of thing. And there were two dogs that lived in the area by the names of Bummer and Lazarus. Now, Bummer was the first to appear. He was something of a Newfoundland mix. And he would find scraps from store owners or bars, things like that, to feed himself. And one day he came across a dog that had been severely injured, another mongrel, but this one was more of a hound. And he nursed that dog back to health, brought it food, and that was Lazarus. And they became inseparable friends after that. Now, they were cared for by the merchants of Montgomery Street because they had a special talent for catching rats. The city was teeming with rats in those days, one must remember. And they had a talent for catching rats. They would catch tens of thousands of them in their lifetimes. 400 in just one session, according to a newspaper account. The city, however, was also run with wild dogs that were biting people. And the Board of Supervisors had to take action. They passed a law that stated that any unclaimed or unmuzzled dog had to be destroyed, and included in that list, unfortunately, were Bummer and Lazarus. Well, the merchants of Montgomery Street would not have that. They did not want to lose their champion ratters. So they got the Board of Supervisors to pass a second law, that exempted Bummer and Lazarus from the first law, and thereby made them the wards of the people, beloved by all. Now, many people associate the dogs with me, and that is unfortunate because they were never my dogs. They may have followed me around. There's some documentation that may have happened, but they couldn't have belonged to me. They were the dogs of the people. So they were never actually my dogs, but they are heavily associated with me. So a good book on the subject, if you'd like to learn more, is this book right here. As you can see, it's well marked with things I'm going to be showing you. Bummer and Lazarus, San Francisco's Famous Dogs, by Malcolm E. Barker, a wonderful Marin County-based historian whom I've had the honor of meeting on a number of occasions. Ironic, though, that Barker would write a book about the dogs, but he did write the definitive book about them. So I wanted to show you a few things in here about them. Well, first of all, here is a plaque placed by the Ancient and Honorable Order of E. Clampus Vitus, also known as the Clampers. It's in Redwood Park next to the Transamerica Pyramid. They placed that there in 1992. We'll probably do a segment on the Clampers at some point, I'm sure. Let me show you another thing here. So here's the one that really started it all. This is called The Three Bummers by Edward Jump. And as you can see, it depicts me at a saloon's lunch buffet enjoying the bill of fare, and Bummer and Lazarus looking up at me longingly, awaiting for a scrap to be tossed to them. This is what probably started the whole myth about them being my dogs. But Barker does an excellent job in his book of really dispelling that myth. Now, Bummer and Lazarus would eventually die. Lazarus went first, and then Bummer a number of years later. And they were mourned by the city. Here's another lithograph. I believe this is by Jump. And this is Lazarus's funeral. And as you can see, I'm dressed as the Pope there, and swinging a rat. That's a kind of an interesting one, to say the least. And let me see what this one is. This one is, this is a Bummer's funeral. And you can see that Lazarus is looking down at him from the heavens, missing his friend who's now been reunited with. And believe it or not, Bummer and Lazarus are actually eulogized by none other than Mark Twain. We'll talk about him a little bit later on too. We have a few problems with Mr. Samuel Clemens, but that's not for this particular broadcast. So this is actually Mark Twain's obituary for Bummer. It is taken from the Californian or the Call. There seems to be no agreement on to which. November 11th, 1865. Exit Bummer. The old vagrant Bummer is really dead at last, although he has more respect than his obsequious vassal, the dog Lazarus. His exit has not made half as much stir in the newspaper world as signaled the departure of the latter. I think it is because he died a natural death, died with his friends around him to smooth his pillow and wipe his death damp from his brow, and received his last words of love and resignation, because he died full of years and honor, disease, and fleas. Bummer should have died sooner, but there was a time when his death would have been left a lasting legacy and fame to his name. Now, however, he will be forgotten in a few days. Well, that's not true. We're still talking about Bummer and Lazarus over 150 years later. What dogs can claim that? And at the end of his obituary, he says that Bummer's skin is to be stuffed and placed with that of Lazarus, which is true. It was originally thought that, I need to backtrack a little bit. They were indeed both taxidermied when they died, and they were placed atop a bar on 425 Sansom Street called Martin's Saloon. There they would be for many years, and in the first edition of Barker's book, and by the way, if you get the book, you can find it on Amazon, make sure to get the second edition because it's updated as The Fate of Bummer and Lazarus. So it was thought that they burned up in the 1906 earthquake and fire, but he discovered 2 newspaper clippings for the second edition of his book. Sorry, there's a mosquito. Where the first one is from February of 1906, stating that the bar had donated them to the Golden Gate Park Museum, which is now the De Young, and that they were there for many years. And then he came across a 1910 story that said they were being sent out to be re-taxidermied and would be placed in the natural history section of the museum. That's where the trail went cold for many, many years until I contacted the De Young Museum and had them go through their ledgers for 1910. I'd like to thank a fellow clamper brother, Lars Nylander, for finding this ledger entry that when they were sent out to the taxidermist, they were filled with bugs and had to be destroyed. I was rather helping to find them, but you can't write history, folks. History writes itself. Well, I've gone a little longer in today's. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll try to keep the other ones around 3 to 4 minutes, but we've gone over 7 minutes today. So stay safe, stay healthy, be kind to each other, and until I speak to you again, have a wonderful day.